The image of a group of soldiers raising the American flag over Iwo Jima is arguably one of the most iconic photos in all of American history. This was at the end of a brutal 36-day battle to pacify an island strategically held by the Japanese during World War II that resulted in some of the most horrific fighting that had been seen over the course of the entire Pacific campaign. This was the Battle of Iwo Jima, literally named Sulphur Island, and like its name, this was absolute hell on earth. Located 750 miles off of the coast of Japan, the island of Iwo Jima had 3 airfields that could serve as staging facilities for a potential invasion of mainland Japan, something that, prior to the development and use of the atomic bomb, was seen as a brutal necessity. American forces would invade the island on February 19, 1945, and in the ensuing several weeks of battle, it is believed that all but 200 or so of the 21,000 Japanese forces on the island were killed, as were almost 7,000 Marines. Because of the brutality of the fighting, and the fact that the battle occurred fairly close to the end of World War II, Iwo Jima and those who lost their lives trying to capture the island retain a great deal of significance even to this very day, many decades after the fighting had ever stopped. Because of that, what it is that we're going to be doing here today, my friends, on the History of Everything, is that we're going to be telling the full story of how it all happened, keeping the memory of the fallen alive for future generations. The thing is, in order to be able to talk about this battle, as always, we need to go back and explain some context. In this case, the Pacific campaign of World War II itself, because as you all know how it is that we actually function and do things on here, well, we explain things a lot. I say this because, while much of the focus on World War II definitely revolves around the European theater, which officially began in 1939, there is a debate as to whether or not World War II technically started earlier because of Japanese expansion in Asia, if you go and include the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, when I talk about that here, of course, you can argue about it all you want in the comments, whether this is from the podcast itself on Spotify or whether you are looking at this on YouTube, whatever it is. I am merely saying there is a debate, and the Pacific theater is typically not given as much attention when talking about World War II, unless it is that you are an American or perhaps Australian or a Kiwi. So, we really need to set the stage here. The roots of Japan's World War II involvement lie in the rise of militarism during the 1920s and the 1930s. Following World War I, Japan would face economic challenges, political instability, and growing nationalist sentiment. The military, particularly the Imperial Japanese Army, would gain significant influence over the government. Ultra-nationalist groups promoted the idea of Japan's divine mission to lead Asia and to free it from Western colonialism, a concept that became known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In 1931, Japan would stage the Mukden Incident as a pretext to invade Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. By 1932, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing Puyi, who was actually, fun fact from this, the last Qing emperor, as its nominal ruler, which we probably need to do an episode specifically dedicated to exactly just that. The League of Nations would of course condemn the invasion, leading Japan to withdraw from the organization in 1933 and further isolating itself from the international community, but at the time that this was, during the interwar period, no one could really do anything. The League of Nations was a weak entity, and it could do absolutely nothing once war broke out again. Full-scale war would break out between Japan and China in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. Japanese forces would quickly go and capture major cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and the capital, Nanjing. The capture of Nanjing in December of 1937 was something that was truly horrifying, as it was marked by the Nanjing Massacre, also called the Rape of Nanjing, or Nanking, depending on how you're pronouncing it. Here, the Japanese troops would kill an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war and commit widespread sexual violence. It was horrifying. I'm going to use that word a lot over the course of this episode. Despite Japan's initial success in its endeavors, the war would bog down into a protracted conflict. China, under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, would refuse to surrender despite losing territory and industrial capacity. Japan would control the eastern Chinese coastal regions, but it couldn't really defeat China's interior forces, which drastically outnumbered them, even if they were severely under-equipped, which in turn, over the years, rather than providing resources as planned, the conflict would drain Japan's resources as international opinion would increasingly turn against them. As Japan's war in China continued, it sought to secure resources and to strengthen its position internationally. In 1940, Japan would sign the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, which would become the basis of the Axis powers. Part of the reason that this alliance was done in the first place was that Japan wished to deter the United States from entering the war against them, despite, of course, the United States' more isolationist policies. Japan would also, during this time, occupy French Indochina over the course of 1940 to 1941 to secure resources and to cut off the supply routes to China. In response, the United States would go and impose increasingly strict economic sanctions, including an oil embargo in August of 1941 that threatened Japan's war effort. As a result, Japan would face a choice: either withdraw from China and Indochina to end sanctions, or ignore all of it, seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia by force, and as I'm sure many of us are aware by now, they chose the latter. On December 7, 1941, Japan would launch a surprise military strike against the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack would kill over 2,400 Americans and damage or destroy numerous ships and aircraft. Simultaneously, Japan would go and attack American, British, and Dutch territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and from this, the following months would see Japan achieve remarkable military successes, though the degree to which they are remarkable is something that is in question considering how lightly defended things arguably were, considering what had already been going down in Europe for the past couple of years. Hong Kong would surrender on Christmas Day in 1941, British forces in Malaya and Singapore would surrender in February of 1942, the Dutch East Indies, which is modern Indonesia, would fall in March of 1942, the Philippines would fall in May of 1942 after a brutal campaign, and by mid-1942, Japan would effectively control an empire spanning from the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south, and from Burma in the west to the Gilbert Islands in the east. It was huge. Japan would effectively experience non-stop expansion during this time, and to some, they seemed unstoppable, until the pivotal battle of Midway in June of 1942. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese planes, which allowed the US Navy to ambush the Japanese fleet at this time. The US would go and destroy all 4 of Japan's large aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, which had been involved in the Pearl Harbor attack. Japan never really recovered from this loss of naval aviation power and experienced personnel. From that point on, America was on the attack. In August of 1942, U.S. Marines would land on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the first major American offensive in the Pacific. The ensuing 6-month campaign was something that was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in land, sea, and air battles. Japan's defeat in Guadalcanal would mark the end of its expansion and the beginning of a slow, costly retreat. But here's the thing. If America tried to take every single occupied Japanese post between Indonesia and the main islands of Japan, it would take ages and cost literal boatloads of blood. So, from that case, why not just not do that? That became the idea. From that point on, under the dual commands of Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, the Allies would embark on a grueling island-hopping strategy. To explain, this campaign was not a simple advance, blindly leaping forward, but rather a series of very costly amphibious assaults that were designed to seize strategically vital islands while bypassing and isolating heavily fortified Japanese strongholds that, technically speaking, you didn't really have to take. Instead, you could go around them, cut them off from supply, and let them starve. The first major test of this strategy was the Guadalcanal campaign, a months-long battle of attrition in a hellish jungle environment where both sides would bleed for a single airfield. Ultimately, this would end in the first major Japanese land defeat. The offensive would then roll westward through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands in late 1943 and early 1944, before targeting the critical Marianas Islands. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in mid-1944 was a strategic masterstroke, as it placed the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, initiating a devastating air campaign against the Japanese home islands. At the same time that this was going down, MacArthur would go and fulfill his famous promise to return to the Philippines with the massive invasion of Leyte in October of 1944, which, from that, triggered the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, where the remnants of the Japanese surface fleet were effectively destroyed, thus eliminating it as a strategic threat and allowing American forces to move forward at their own pace. It is here then, now, my friends, that we enter the final push. The Japanese had been steadily losing ground in the Pacific over the course of 1944 heading into 1945. Their island possessions were being overtaken or cut off by the Americans, and their war strategists and planners knew that they weren't going to be able to win against the United States, no matter what it is they publicly went and declared or said in propaganda leaflets. It just wasn't going to happen. Japanese shipping was being disrupted by American submarines, and resources were running very low. Men had been killed by the thousands in previous battles, and the loss of life was taking its toll on the military and the population at large. Unable to win and refusing to surrender, Japan's military leaders would change their strategy to make the Pacific War, instead of an outright war, one of a battle of attrition. They hoped to make the fighting so incredibly costly for the Allies that eventually they would be bled out and they would accept a negotiated peace instead of demanding unconditional surrender from Japan. Again, they knew that they were not going to be able to win, but at the very least they could try and make sure that they didn't lose too much. Meanwhile, the Americans were committed to keeping the pressure on Japan by taking several key islands in rapid succession. The determination on both sides would then set the stage for what would be the bloodiest battle in U.S. Marine Corps history, the Battle of Iwo Jima. Now, the question that many people wonder here is probably why Iwo Jima was deemed to be so crucial. After all, there were plenty of islands that Americans could go and build or had already seized air bases on. And the answer is that, well, it's a bit complicated. By late 1944, the United States had established massive air bases in the Mariana Islands, from which the new B-29 Superfortress bombers were conducting long-range strategic bombing raids against the Japanese home islands. But there's a little bit of a problem. These missions were fraught with many difficulties. The round trip from the Marianas to Tokyo was roughly around 3,000 miles, which would push the B-29s to their very limits of their operational range, leaving no margin for any kind of mechanical failure or battle damage. Worse still, the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima, situated almost exactly halfway along the route, was home to 2 operational Japanese airfields and a 3rd under construction. Japanese radar stations on the island could provide early warning of incoming American bomber formations, which would allow interceptors on the home islands to go and scramble and prepare. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima also could harass B-29 formations directly, and bombers from the island could even launch theoretical strikes against American airfields in the Marianas themselves, which could damage parked aircraft on the ground. It was seen as a threat. Not something that necessarily was going to do something, but it could be a threat. The capture of Iwo Jima would eliminate that threat, providing emergency landing strips for crippled B-29s that could not make the return journey, and serve as a forward base for P-51 Mustang long-range escort fighters that could protect the bombers over Japan. The strategic calculus was pretty obvious on both sides if you look at it at first. And while the Americans were planning their assault, the Japanese, knowing they were coming, were prepared to make them pay in blood for every single foot on the island's black volcanic sand. And so actually, on mentioning that black volcanic sand, it is on this note here, my friends, that I wanted to go ahead and pause and say something. The entire reason why we're doing this episode in the first place is because I was reached out to by a company called Presidis that just released a gorgeous brand new Pacific War-themed wristwatch. This thing is absolutely beautiful. This watch, which features the path of American forces through the Pacific and on a black face that is actually made of volcanic ash that is actually from Iwo Jima itself, is something that marks the 81st anniversary of the battle. Like, this watch is something that combines issued grade finishes, practical field watch features, and a map-driven design which intends to honor service members and inspire further learning. It is something that is cool, both in the sense of history and merely just style itself. The dial, actually on this, features subtle campaign markers and dates. It has Pearl Harbor, it's got Guadalcanal, Midway, Iwo Jima, it's so cool because this is something that is much more expanded in comparison to what it is they had done last year. The previous version that they had released for 2025 actually just focused on Iwo Jima itself, while this one for 2026 maps the entire Pacific from it and the forces of America moving through it. I, I gotta say, among all things that I've just received here from companies, it's genuinely something that is amazing, and I'm leaving a link for it down in the description below. This is something that, again, they sponsored this episode in the first place. That's why we're creating it. And for people who actually do love history, I would highly recommend that you go and check this thing out. It is a beautiful piece to have to not only honor the memory of the fallen, but for generally any history lover that really is interested in the past. It's a beautiful statement piece, as well as something that fits your niche. Again, I'm leaving a link for it down in the description. Check it out. Thank you, Persidus, for sponsoring this episode. And with that, we need to get to Iwo Jima itself. The Japanese defense of Iwo Jima was something that was masterminded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a seasoned and actually, from this, amazingly enough, unusually pragmatic officer who had spent time in the United States before the war and didn't really have any illusions about American industrial and military power, something that was a major problem for Japanese leaders who constantly, time and time again, would predict that American forces would simply collapse under the might, that they had no real will or desire for war. Kuribayashi understood that the island was not something that could be held indefinitely, and that there were no reinforcements or resupply that would ever be able to come, as the Japanese Navy and Air Force had already effectively been destroyed by this stage in the war. His goal, therefore, was not victory, at least not in the traditional sense, but rather to inflict such catastrophic casualties on the American invaders that they would reconsider the wisdom of continuing towards the home islands. Because if every single battle that they launched, every single attempt that they made to get closer to the islands resulted in literal shiploads of blood being spent, it is something that the American public back home would not want, and politicians would again potentially be forced to offer terms that could at least be not too unfavorable to Japan. To this end, Kuribayashi would revolutionize Japanese defensive doctrine, explicitly forbidding the suicidal banzai charges that had been characterized earlier in battles like Saipan and Guadalcanal, which he rightly viewed as stupidly wasteful and tactically foolish. Instead, he ordered his approximately 21,000 defenders to dig in and fight a war of attrition from underground. Under his direction, the garrison would construct one of the most formidable defensive networks ever seen in warfare. Over 11 miles of tunnels were carved into the soft volcanic rock, connecting hundreds of pillboxes, blockhouses, artillery positions, and underground chambers. Now, these tunnels were engineered with multiple entrances and exits, ventilation shafts, and reinforced ceilings, designed to withstand naval bombardment. Positions were arranged in overlapping fields of fire, so that any attacking force would be caught in a deadly crossfire from multiple directions. Mount Suribachi, the 546-foot dormant volcano in the southern tip of the island, was honeycombed with gun emplacements and observation posts that commanded a panoramic view of the invasion beaches. The northern plateau, a nightmarish landscape of rocky gorges, ridges, and natural caves, was similarly fortified into a killing ground of just unimaginable depth and complexity. Kuribayashi's orders were explicit to his men. He knew that they were not going to survive, but they were going to make the Americans pay for every inch that they took. Every man was required to kill 10 Americans before dying. No one was to retreat or surrender. This island was to be defended to the last man. And that is exactly what they were going to do. The American plan, designated Operation Detachment, called for the massive amphibious assault by the 5th Amphibious Corps under Major General Harry Schmidt, comprising 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd Marine Division, the 4th Marine Division, and the 5th Marine Division, totaling approximately 70,000 combat troops. The overall operation was commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, with the amphibious force under Rear Admiral Raymond Keller-Turner. The overall operation was commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, with the amphibious force under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. The Marines would request 10 days of sustained naval bombardment prior to the landing, believing that it was essential to soften the deeply entrenched defenses. But unfortunately for them, they were allocated only 3 days due to competing demands for naval assets elsewhere, especially for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa and the carrier strikes against the Japanese mainland. This decision would ultimately prove to be very costly. The 3 days of bombardment, while yes, impressive in volume, were barely effective against the deeply buried Japanese positions. Shells and bombs could crater the surface, but they barely scratched the underground fortifications that had been reinforced. The Japanese, disciplined and patient under Kuribayashi's command, would hold their fire during the bombardment, giving the Americans the false impression that their defenses had mostly been neutralized. When the first wave of Marines would hit the southeastern beaches on the morning of February 19th, 1945, they initially encountered very light resistance, and for a brief, deceptive moment, it really seemed that the landing might actually be easier than anticipated. But no, that is not what was going to happen. That belief and illusion was shattered within just a couple minutes. As the beaches began to fill with men, vehicles, and equipment, Kuribayashi would finally give the order to open fire. And the effect was instantly catastrophic. Pre-registered artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire would erupt from seemingly every single direction, turning the crowded beaches into a killing ground. The volcanic ash that constituted the beach was so loose and steep that men would sink to their knees with every single step. Vehicles would bog down immediately, and there was virtually no cover to be had. Landing craft were destroyed at the waterline. Marines who made it ashore would find themselves crawling forward under a hail of fire with nowhere to really hide. It was a truly horrifying affair, and the first day alone would see over 2,400 American casualties. The situation was so dire that some commanders even considered the possibility that the landing might fail entirely. But no. The Marines would push forward with extraordinary determination, inching their way off the beaches and beginning the slow, agonizing advance inland. Combat engineers would work under fire to try and clear paths through minefields and obstacles, while Navy corpsmen, the medics attached to Marine units, would perform acts of incredible heroism tending to the wounded in the open. It was, as I said before, a truly horrifying, absolutely brutal affair. But the Marines would stubbornly push on. And by the evening of the first day, the 19th of February, 30,000 Marines had landed. About 40,000 more would follow. And aboard the command ship USS El Dorado, Lieutenant General Holland Smith would see the lengthy casualty reports and was briefed on the slow progress of the ground forces. To the war correspondents that were covering the operation, Smith would turn to them and remark, and I quote, "I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running the show is one smart bastard." End quote. Really, this was something different than the Marines had experienced over the previous months, and that was going to be a brutal lesson that they were going to have to learn. From here, the Marines would brace themselves for the traditional Japanese nighttime banzai charge, something that had characterized virtually every single Pacific Island battle that they had encountered so far. At Saipan, thousands of Japanese soldiers had hurled themselves at American lines in massive human wave attacks. At other islands, infiltrators had crept into Marine positions in the darkness to kill with bayonets and grenades. The Marines, expecting this, would dig in as best they could in the miserable volcanic ash. They would set up fields of fire, and they waited. But, amazingly, the charge never came. Kuribayashi had held his men in their positions, refusing to waste lives on the kind of futile frontal assaults that had doomed Japanese garrisons elsewhere. Instead, the Japanese continued their artillery and mortar harassment throughout the night, denying the exhausted Marines any rest and inflicting a steady trickle of additional casualties. Small infiltration teams, yes, did go and probe the Marine lines, and there were scattered close quarters encounters in the darkness, but there was no massed attack. This disciplined restraint was, if anything, more unsettling to the Marines, who were actually used to the more predictable pattern of Japanese defensive warfare. It signaled that this battle was going to be something that was different. They were facing a commander who intended to fight a war of attrition from prepared positions and bleed the Americans for every inch of ground rather than throwing his forces away in a single dramatic move. And that was far more terrifying. From here, the Marines would have to prepare to move deeper, towards higher ground, where the Japanese were entrenched. With the neck of the island cut, the 28th Marine Regiment under Colonel Harry Liversedge would turn south to assault Mount Suribachi, the 546-foot volcano cone that I had mentioned here before that dominates the southern end of Iwo Jima and provided the Japanese with unparalleled observation over the entire landing area. To understand what it is that I mean, every single movement on the beaches could be seen from Suribachi's summit, and artillery observers that were perched in its caves and crevices had been directing devastatingly accurate fire onto the Marines since the moment they came ashore. Taking the mountain was essential, not only to eliminate the observation advantage, but also for the enormous psychological boost that it would provide to the thousands of Marines that were fighting across the rest of the island. It had to be taken, and so it was. But the assault on Suribachi was a grinding, close-quarters nightmare. The mountain was honeycombed with caves, tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions at every single level, from its base all the way to its crater rim. The Japanese defenders would fight with extraordinary tenacity, emerging from the cave to fire on advancing Marines, then immediately going and retreating through connecting tunnels to reappear on another position. Flamethrowers, as a result, became the weapon of choice. Both the portable M2 flamethrowers that were carried by individual Marines and the larger mechanized flamethrowers that were mounted on Sherman tanks. Marines would approach a cave mouth under the cover fire, blast it with a stream of burning napalm-thickened fuel, and then seal it with demolition charges. This was devastatingly effective, but the interconnected tunnel system also meant that even positions that appeared to be destroyed could then theoretically be reoccupied by Japanese soldiers who simply moved through underground passageways from adjacent positions. The fighting in this part of the battle would become intensely personal. Marines could hear Japanese soldiers talking, coughing, and moving behind thin walls of rock, and combat would frequently occur at distances that could be measured more in feet rather than yards. You could see them, not just the whites of their eyes, but you could see the smudges of dirt on their nose. Hand grenades were exchanged back and forth, sometimes with Japanese defenders throwing American grenades back before they detonated, and Americans returning and doing the exact same thing with Japanese grenades. Progress was measured in yards per day, not miles gained, and casualties would mount steadily. By February 23rd, after 4 days of relentless fighting, the 28th Marines had fought their way around and up the slopes of Suribachi, reducing defensive positions one by one. That morning, a patrol of approximately 40 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, led by 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreer, was ordered to climb the summit and secure the crater rim. They carried with them a small American flag that had been obtained from the transport ship USS Missoula, and from this, the patrol would make the climb under intermittent fire and engage in several firefights with Japanese defenders near the top, killing them with grenades and small arms fire. At approximately 10:20 a.m. in the morning, the flag would be raised on a length of rope found in the debris of the summit. Down below, the sight of the stars and stripes flying atop Suribachi would electrify the Marines on the beaches and across the island. Finally, progress had been made. Ships offshore would sound their horns and whistles, men cheered, some would weep. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who was observing the battle from offshore, would turn to General Holland Smith and say, and I quote, "Holland, the raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years, end quote. It was the success they needed. For those of you that are listening to this right now, you would probably think that that iconic photo that we described here before at the very beginning of the episode, where the flag is being raised by a series of Marines, is what we are talking about here. And from that, you would only be partially correct. Technically speaking, this is that moment. However, that flag that we just described is only the first flag, a much smaller one, something that was done as an ad hoc measure. Several hours later, after that first small flag had been raised, a decision was made to replace it with a much larger one. Now, accounts vary as to whether this was because the battalion commander wanted to keep the first flag as a memento, or because the commanders wanted a flag that could be seen from greater distances, or some combination of reasons we don't really necessarily know. But a larger flag was procured from LST 779, and a second patrol would go and carry it to the summit. And it was during this second flag raising that the Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal would snap the now immortal photograph of 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggling to raise the heavy flagpole against the wind. That image would capture Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Susley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Renee Gagnon, and Navy Pharmacist Mate Second Class John Bradley performing this action. And that photo, that is the one you are thinking of. That became arguably the most famous war photograph ever taken and would later serve as the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial near Arlington National Cemetery. In fact, it's that photo being so incredibly iconic that is what led the Soviets to do the exact same thing over the Reichstag. That, if you've ever played Call of Duty and know what I'm talking about, or have seen that historical photo right there. This was, of course, a very iconic moment, but tragically, 3 of the 6 men in the photograph, Strank, Block, and Susley, they would all be killed in action on Iwo Jima before the battle actually ended. Because even though I am describing this right now, you probably are aware that Just because that flag was raised, despite that success, the battle was not over. This was within the first several days of a battle that would go on for more than a month. With Mount Suribachi secured, the focus of the entire battle would shift to the north, where the vast majority of Kuribayashi's forces would remain entrenched in what was arguably the most formidable defensive terrain American forces had encountered in the entire Pacific War. The southern third of Iwo Jima, where the landings had taken place and where Suribachi stood, was relatively flat and open. Yes, it was difficult enough to fight across, and there were many strong defensive positions, but that was nothing compared to what lay ahead. The northern two-thirds of the island was a tortured landscape of rocky ridges, deep ravines, natural caves, jagged outcroppings, and broken ground that seemed almost purposely designed by God to defend or protect the defender. The volcanic geology of the island would create a maze of natural depressions, sinkholes, and sheer rock faces that would channel attackers into kill zones and provided the Japanese with an almost unlimited supply of natural fortifications to augment their already extensive man-made tunnel network. In many cases, the sulfurous heat from volcanic activity below the surface made the ground warm to the touch, and toxic fumes would seep from vents and cracks in the rock, adding a surreal and hellish quality to the battlefield. The terrain was so broken and compartmentalized that it was nearly impossible for commanders to maintain visual contact with their units or to coordinate any large-scale maneuvers. The battle for northern Iwo Jima would thus devolve into hundreds of small, savage engagements fought by squads and platoons. Tiny groups of Marines attacking individual bunkers, caves, and pillboxes, one at a time in a brutal, exhausting process that seemed to have no end. It was quite literally a hell on earth scenario. But none of that mattered. The Marines had to move forward. And so the 3 Marine divisions were arrayed across the island from east to west. The 5th Marine Division would hold the left flank along the western coast. The 3rd Marine Division, which had been committed from floating reserve on February 21st, would hold the center. And the 4th Marine Division would hold the right flank along the eastern coast. The plan from here was a straightforward frontal assault northward across the entire width of the island, a blunt approach that was dictated by the simple reality that Iwo Jima was simply way too small and the terrain too rugged to permit any clever flanking maneuvers or encirclements. You quite literally could not move forward fast enough for any maneuvers to truly matter. There was no room for finesse or anything like that. The Marines would have to attack directly into the teeth of Kuribayashi's prepared defenses and destroy them one position at a time. General Schmidt and his division commanders understood that this meant a slow, costly advance, but there was really no alternative. The 4th Marine Division, advancing up the eastern side of the island, would run headlong to what became known quite simply and brutally as the meat grinder, which, if that name tells you anything, you best be prepared for what it is that we're going to be talking about now. A complex of 3 mutually supporting fortified positions that together would form one of the most lethal defensive concentrations of the entire war. These 3 positions were Hill 382, a rugged elevation that was the highest point in the eastern part of the island and honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions. You had the Turkey Knob, a natural rock formation that was reinforced with concrete into a massive blockhouse surrounded by smaller fighting positions. And you had the Amphitheater, a natural bowl-shaped depression that was surrounded by ridges from which the Japanese defenders could pour fire down into any attacking force that was unfortunate enough to enter the basin. These 3 positions were then connected by tunnels and could provide supporting fire for one another, meaning that an assault on any one of them would draw fire from the other 2. The approaches to all 3 were covered by interlocking fields of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire, with the ground between them being sown with mines and booby traps. The fighting for the meat grinder would end up consuming the 4th Marine Division for more than 2 weeks and inflict casualties so severe that effectively entire battalions were reduced to fractions of their original strength. The daily pattern was grimly repetitive and soul-crushing in its monotony. Every single morning, the Marines would attack behind a barrage of naval gunfire, artillery, and airstrikes. They could advance a few dozen yards, sometimes 100 yards on a good day, taking horrible casualties from fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They would go and seize a ridge, maybe a section of a trench, or a cluster of cave mouths, only to find that the Japanese had retreated through the tunnels to the next line of positions. And then at night, the Marines would dig in and endure hours of mortar harassment, infiltration attempts, and nerve-shredding tension of waiting in pitch darkness for an enemy that they could hear, but they couldn't really see. Japanese soldiers would creep out of the tunnels behind the American lines, reoccupying positions that had been cleared during the day, so the Marines who thought that they had just secured an area would then find themselves sometimes taking fire from their rear the very next morning. The psychological toll was immense, with men going days without sleep sometimes, surviving on adrenaline, fear, and whatever cold rations they could actually choke down between firefights. You couldn't use fires to heat your food because any light that would be there at night would just make you a target for mortars or other such things. The constant proximity to death, the ever-present whine of incoming mortar rounds, the crack of sniper fire, the sudden explosion of a mine underfoot, this would push even the most hardened veterans to the edge of their mental endurance. Combat fatigue casualties would mount alongside the physical wounded, and entire units had to be pulled from the line and reorganized because they had lost so many men that they could effectively no longer function, well, effectively. I mean, when we were going and talking about this, the battle for Hill 382 alone would last nearly a week of continuous fighting. Marines would attack the hill repeatedly, sometimes gaining the crest only to then be driven off by savage counterattacks and murderous fire from adjacent positions. Tanks would be brought forward to try and provide close support, but the thing is, because of everything that we've been describing here so far, the broken terrain would channel them into narrow approaches, where they were then vulnerable to anti-tank guns and mines, and many of these could get easily knocked out. When tanks did manage to get into position, these were incredibly valuable. Their 75mm guns and machine guns could suppress Japanese firing positions long enough for infantry to close in with flamethrowers and demolition charges. But the thing is, there was never really enough tanks, and as a result, their crews would suffer heavily. Alongside this, the Turkey Knob proved equally resistant. The concrete blockhouse at its center would absorb round after round of direct fire from tanks, artillery, and naval guns without being destroyed. Marines would attack it from multiple directions, blasting it with every weapon that was available, and it simply would not fall. Individual Marines would perform some crazy acts of heroism, charging enemy positions with flamethrowers, satchel charges, oftentimes at point-blank range, and then many dying in the attempt. But from this, slowly, agonizingly, they would grind down the Japanese defenses through sheer persistence and continuous sacrifice. The amphitheater was perhaps the worst of all of them. Marines who had descended into the bowl were fired upon from encircling ridges with no cover and no room to maneuver. And extracting wounded men from its depths was an ordeal that, on its own, cost additional lives. It took the 4th Marine Division until roughly March 10th to finally reduce the meat grinder complex. And by that point, the division had suffered casualties so severe that many of its rifle companies had been reduced to a handful of men that were being led by corporals and sergeants because the higher officers had long since been killed or wounded. While the 4th Marine Division was being chewed apart in the meat grinder, the 5th Marine Division was fighting an equally desperate battle alongside the western coast and through the rugged terrain of the island's northwestern sector. The 5th Division's advance would carry it through a series of fortified ridges, gorges, and rocky draws that the Japanese had turned into interlocking defensive positions that were remarkably strong. One of the most bitterly contested areas was a landscape feature that the Marines ironically named, or I guess maybe not necessarily ironic, Death Valley, which was very fitting. This was a narrow corridor between two high ridge lines that was swept by fire from both sides, making any movement through it literally suicidal during daylight hours. Adjacent to Death Valley was Hill 362A, a heavily fortified elevation that commanded the surrounding terrain and served as a key anchor point for the Japanese defensive line in the west. And that fight for Hill 362A was going to be something that was representative of the entire northern campaign for how brutal it was. Marines would attack up slopes so steep they had to climb on hands and knees at many points, pulling themselves up over rocks, while Japanese defenders would roll grenades down at them and pour machine gun fire from above. When the Marines finally reached the top, they found that the Japanese had constructed positions on the reverse slope that you couldn't actually reach by supporting fire from below. And close quarters fighting with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools and bare hands would thus erupt among the rocks. It would take repeated assaults and horrible losses to secure the hill, and even after it was ostensibly captured, Japanese soldiers would continue to emerge from hidden tunnel exits for literally days afterwards to attack Marines occupying the position. This was something that absolutely sucked, and they weren't going to be the only ones that were going to experience hardship. The 5th Marine Division's advance through the northwestern sector of Iwo Jima was something that was going to carry with it a number of tragedies that would just underscore how incredibly indiscriminate and brutal this fighting was. If you recall earlier when I was talking about the raising of the flag, 3 of the 6 men who had been captured in Joe Rosenthal's iconic flag raising photograph were killed during the weeks following the capture of Mount Suribachi, with their deaths being a stark reminder that the famous image represented only one moment in a battle at the very beginning that still had weeks of slaughter ahead of it. Sergeant Michael Strank, a Czech-born immigrant who had become a naturalized American citizen and was widely regarded as one of the finest squad leaders in the 5th Marine Division, was killed on March 1st when a shell believed by some accounts to have been a accidental short round from an American naval gunfire barrage, though this is something that ended up being debated, would strike his position, sending a fragment of shrapnel through his body. He died almost instantly. Strank had been the natural leader of the group, the man who had actually organized the flag-raising detail and positioned the men around the pole, and his loss was felt deeply throughout the entire unit. That same day, Corporal Harlan Block, a former high school football star from a small town of Willasco, Texas, was killed by a Japanese mortar round when his unit was engaged in the fighting near Hill 362A. Block had been misidentified in the original photograph as Sergeant Hank Henson, which was an error that would not actually officially be corrected until years after the war, meaning that his family initially did not even know that their son was one of the famous flag raisers. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, who's a young man from rural Kentucky who had been the youngest of the flag raisers at just 19 years old, was killed by a Japanese sniper bullet on March 21st, literally only 5 days before the island was officially declared secure. When word of his death reached his hometown of Hilltop, Kentucky, his mother reportedly collapsed on the front porch. Of the 3 surviving flag raisers, Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Native American from Arizona, Private First Class Renee Gagnon, and Navy pharmacist mate Second Class John Bradley, seeing the potential issue that this could cause propaganda-wise, they were pulled from the battle and sent home to participate in a massive war bond tour. A decision that did, in fact, save their lives, but it left deep psychological scars, especially on Hayes, who struggled with survivor's guilt and alcoholism for the rest of his life. He was really unable to reconcile the hero worship that he received with the memory of the friends that he had left behind in the black sand of Iwo Jima. Hayes would actually end up dying in 1955 at the age of 32. And while the official cause of death was exposure and alcohol poisoning, those who knew him really understood that it was Iwo Jima that had killed him, just as surely as it had killed Strank, Block, and Sousley. The difference was this just took a hell of a lot longer. Still, at the time that I'm saying this here, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We have to go back. While the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions were grinding through the meat grinder and the northwestern ridges respectively, the 3rd Marine Division would hold the center of the American line and faced its own unique horrors. The 3rd Division's zone of advance would carry it directly through the heart of Iwo Jima's main defensive belt, an area that included Airfield No. 2, the partially completed Airfield No. 3, and a series of fortified hills and ridge lines that Kuribayashi had designated as the core of his island defense. The division had been committed from floating reserve on February 21st, 2 days after landing day, wading ashore through the same chaotic wreckage-strewn beaches that had already claimed so many lives. Its initial assignment was to drive straight north, splitting the Japanese defenses and preventing the enemy from shifting forces laterally between the eastern and western sectors. The 3rd Division's advance through the center of the island, though, would bring it into contact with some of the most heavily fortified terrain on Iwo Jima. The area surrounding Airfield No. 2 was ringed with concrete blockhouses, covered trenches, and artillery positions that had been carefully sited to create overlapping fields of fire across the flat open ground of the runway itself. Crossing the airfield would require Marines to advance across hundreds of yards of open terrain with virtually no cover, exposed to fire from fortified positions on the high ground beyond. Units that attempted the crossing would suffer terrifying casualties, and the airfield became littered with bodies of Marines that were cut down mid-stride by machine gun and mortar fire. Engineers would work frantically under fire to bulldoze makeshift berms and to make depressions that could provide at least some form of minimal cover, But the Japanese had zeroed in on every inch of the airfield and punished any movement across it. Beyond the airfield, the 3rd Division would encounter a particularly nightmarish area that Marines came to call Cushman's Pocket, named after Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cushman, whose battalion was among those that were tasked with reducing it. Cushman's Pocket was this complex of ravines, ridges, and fortified cave positions in the northeastern part of the island that really defied repeated attempts at capture. The terrain was so broken and convoluted that Marines that were trying to advancing into it would frequently lose contact with each other's groups, and small groups of men would then find themselves cut off completely and surrounded by Japanese defenders who seemed to materialize from the very rock itself. The fighting in Cushman's Pocket would be characterized by extremely close-range combat. We're talking grenades being thrown back and forth across distances of only like a few yards. Flamethrower operators would crawl on their bellies to get within range of cave mouths, while snipers were trying to kill them. And desperate hand-to-hand struggles in the mouths of tunnels and among the tumbled boulders was commonplace. It took nearly 2 weeks to fully reduce Cushman's Pocket, and the cost for Marine lives was absolutely enormous. Really, when it is that we are talking about this, one of the most remarkable individual stories to emerge from the 3rd Marine Division fighting in the center was that of Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, a demolition specialist from West Virginia who on February 23rd, which was actually the same day that the flag was being raised on Suribachi, he would single-handedly assault a series of Japanese pillboxes that were holding up his unit's advance near Airfield No. 2. Armed with a flamethrower and covered by 4 Marine riflemen, 2 of which actually got killed during the action, Williams would spend 4 hours crawling, sprinting, and fighting his way from one fortified position to the next, destroying pillbox after pillbox with streams of burning hot fuel. He poked the nozzle of his flamethrower directly into the firing slits and the ventilation shafts, and he would incinerate the occupants. From there, immediately move on to the next position, reload his flamethrower multiple times under heavy fire, and keep going. His actions would single-handedly break the defensive line and allowed his unit to advance. From this, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary valor that day. In fact, Williams would go on to become the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the battle. He would live all the way until the year 2022, when he passed away at the ripe old age of 98. A living link to one of the most horrible days of fighting in American military history, but for him, he lived. As February gave way to March, though, the battle would settle into a relentless grinding rhythm, something that tested the physical and psychological limits of every single Marine on the island. Each day would essentially follow the exact same pattern. Before dawn, the Marines in their foxholes or their fighting positions would begin to prepare for the day's attack. They would check their weapons, they would distribute ammunition, they would eat whatever cold rations were available because, again, if you actually tried to light a fire, this would just give away your position and allow you to get mortar fired on. And then, at a designated hour, supporting arms would open up. Naval gunfire from ships offshore, artillery from batteries that had been brought ashore and positioned along the front line, and airstrikes from carrier-based aircraft that would scream in low over the Marine positions would drop bombs and napalm on Japanese fortifications just ahead of them. Now, the effectiveness of this preparatory fire could vary wildly across the battlefield. Against surface positions and exposed trench lines, it could be absolutely devastating. But against the deeply buried bunkers and the tunnel systems that formed the backbone of Kuribayashi's defense, that oftentimes was nothing more than a little noisy prelude or opening for the battle that did just more to reshape the land than actually kill any defenders or break their defensive line. When the bombardment would lift, the Marine infantry would rise from their positions and advance, moving forward in short rushes from cover to cover, squad by squad, fire team by fire team, and every yard that was gained was contested with a ferocity that would just defy common sense. The Japanese had prepared their positions with meticulous care. Every ridge, every ravine, every pile of rocks concealing firing positions, all of these had to be individually located and then destroyed. The process of eliminating a single fortified cave or bunker was a time-consuming, dangerous, and physically exhausting ordeal that repeated hundreds of times per day across the width of the island. A typical engagement would begin when a Marine squad would advance through broken terrain, suddenly came under fire from a concealed position, a burst of machine gun fire from a cave's mouth that was partially hidden behind rocks, or maybe the sudden crack of a sniper rifle from a camouflage spider hole that was virtually invisible until the occupant opened fire. The squad would hit the dirt, take cover behind whatever was available, whether that was a rock, an outcropping, a shell crater, a tree stump, whatever it was, and they would try to locate the source of the fire before all of them were killed. Once the position was identified, the squad leader would organize a fire and maneuver attack. A base of fire element, usually 2 or 3 riflemen and perhaps a Browning automatic rifle team, would then lay down suppressive fire on the enemy, while it is that an assault element would work its way around the flank, crawling and scrambling through the rocks under fire. If a flamethrower operator was available, he would be brought forward, crouching low under the weight of the 70-pound fuel tank strapped to his back, knowing that even a single bullet or fragment striking those tanks could potentially turn him into a human torch. And from that, the flamethrower man would work his way to within range, typically about 40 yards, though sometimes they had to be much closer, and would try to send a stream of burning napalm into the cave mouth or firing slit. If it worked, the effect was horrific. The burning fuel would consume the oxygen inside of the enclosed space, and the defenders who were not killed directly by the flames would oftentimes suffocate in the superheated airless void that remained. That was in fact how the majority of soldiers ended up dying from flamethrowers, was suffocation, not burning. After the flamethrower had done its work, demolition men would then move forward with satchel charges, canvas bags that were packed with blocks of C2 explosive, and then hurl them into position, collapsing the entrance and entombing anyone that was still left alive inside. Engineers would then often follow up with bulldozers to pile earth and rubble over destroyed positions, permanently sealing it. This entire process, for just like a single cave or bunker, could take anywhere from, half an hour, 30 minutes, to several hours or half the day. And there were hundreds, ultimately thousands of such positions all across the island. Really, the psychological strain of this kind of close quarters attritional combat was devastating in ways that go way beyond simple physical danger. Marines lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, knowing that death could quite literally come at any moment and from any direction. Whether that was from a sniper that was hidden in the crevice of a thing hundreds of yards away, from a mortar round that was falling without warning from the sky, from a mine that was buried in the ash beneath their feet that could suddenly explode, taking out them or their entire squad, or from maybe just a simple Japanese soldier emerging suddenly from a hidden tunnel entrance or a bush just a few yards away. You never knew. Sleep was virtually impossible. The constant bombardment, both incoming Japanese fire and outgoing American supporting fire, would create a ceaseless roar of explosions that could break the nerves and make coherent thought difficult. The stench of death would permeate everything. In the tropical heat, bodies would decompose rapidly, and the volcanic terrain made burial difficult. So the dead, both the American and the Japanese, oftentimes just lay where it is they had fallen for days, swelling and blackening in the sun while the living would fight among them. The sulfurous fumes that would seep from volcanic vents would only add to the choking, nauseating atmosphere, and many Marines would suffer respiratory problems and burning eyes from the chemical-laden air. Water was scarce, and what was available oftentimes had a foul, sulfurous taste that made men gag. Hot meals remained a rarity throughout the battle, and most Marines would subsist on K rations and D rations, that being hard chocolate bars, canned processed meats, stuff like that did provide calories, but not much else. The cumulative effect of all these stressors, the constant danger, the lack of sleep, the dehydration, the stench, the noise, the sight of friends being killed and maimed constantly around them, produced a condition that the military would call at the time combat fatigue, that would later, of course, be recognized as a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Hundreds of Marines would be evacuated from the island with psychological breakdowns so severe that they could no longer function, and thousands more would continue to fight while suffering from varying degree of emotional and mental deterioration that they would have to carry with them for the rest of their lives. But still, the job was not done, and the Japanese would find ways to make it last as long as they possibly could. One of the most maddening and demoralizing aspects of the battle for northern Iwo Jima was the Japanese tactic of reoccupying positions that the Marines had already cleared and believed to be secure. Kuribayashi's tunnel network would make this not only possible, but the regular thing that was done. It was the standard routine. A Marine unit might spend an entire day fighting to capture a particular ridge or a cluster of fortified positions, suffering significant casualties in the process, only to discover that the very following morning that Japanese soldiers had emerged from previously undetected tunnel exits during the night and then reoccupied those exact same positions. This meant that there were times that the exact same ground had to be fought over for 2, maybe 3, or 4 separate times before it was ever actually truly secured. Which, for anyone who is fighting over this, is completely demoralizing. It is a reality that made the already slow advance feel almost Sisyphean, which is, for anyone who is familiar with it, for the story of the guy who is pushing a boulder up a hill only to reach the top and for it to roll down the other side, and he is stuck having to do this again and again and again. That is what it was like for the Marines. It never seemed to end. And so, because of this, the Marines had to develop countermeasures. They would post guards at known tunnel entrances. They would use demolitions to try and collapse as many tunnel passages as they could. They would pump gasoline or water into the openings, and in the case of gasoline, light it all on fire, trying to drown them out, or in this case, suffocate them out when it wasn't water. But the sheer extent and complexity of the underground network made it effectively impossible to seal completely. Japanese soldiers would move through this subterranean world like ghosts, appearing behind American lines to launch sudden attacks on supply parties, command posts, and aid stations before simply vanishing back underground. This infiltration problem was especially a major problem at night. After dark, Japanese soldiers would emerge from tunnel openings that were scattered across the battlefield, many of them in areas that the Marines considered to be well behind the front lines. And from that, they would conduct raids, ambushes, and individual attacks. Sentries were killed silently with bayonets or knives. Mortar positions were overrun. Wounded Marines that were just laying in aid stations were attacked. Supply dumps were raided or destroyed. And the Marines would have to respond to this by establishing strict nighttime security protocols. Password challenges, tripwires, illumination flares that were fired at irregular intervals in order to try and potentially catch Japanese surprise attackers off guard. But the constant threat of nighttime infiltration meant that no one behind the front lines could ever really feel safe. Marines learned to sleep, when it is that they could even sleep at all, with their weapons in their hand and their boots on, ready to fight at a moment's notice. The strain of this unrelenting vigilance, day after day after day, night after night after night, for weeks on end, was soul and mentally crushing. Men became jumpy, they became short-tempered, emotionally numb. Their world would narrow to the immediate concerns of, can I survive tonight? That is all that mattered. Just the next few yards of ground, the next meal, the next hour. Could they go this time without being hit or surprised and stabbed in the back? In fact, one particular incident perhaps shows just how terrible this danger was for the tunnel network. Japanese attackers who emerged from the tunnels near the western beaches on the night of March 8th would strike with a savagery and coordination that completely caught the Americans off guard. The roughly 150 Japanese Navy personnel, many of them armed with swords and sharpened bamboo spears and grenades in addition to rifles and pistols when it is that they actually had ammunition, would pour out of concealed tunnel exits in an area that had for quite a while been considered safely behind American lines. Like, we're talking more than a week. Their targets were the biovac areas of the 5th Marine Division's Pioneer and Shore Party battalions, as well as a contingent of Army Air Force ground crew personnel from the 7th Fighter Command's 21st Fighter Group, who had recently arrived on the island to prepare Airfield No. 1 for P-51 Mustang operations. Many of the Americans in the area were asleep in their foxholes and improvised shelters when the attack began, and the first warning that many had was the sound of screaming and the explosion of grenades in their midst. The fighting that erupted was chaotic, it was desperate, and intensely personal. In the pitch darkness, it was nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe, and the close quarters made firearms as dangerous to friendly troops as to the enemy. So as a result, men fought with knives, entrenching tools, fists, rocks, literally anything it is that they could grab. Japanese attackers would hurl themselves into foxholes on top of sleeping Americans, slashing with bayonets and swords. Marines and airmen who managed to get to their weapons would fire blindly at shadows and sounds, and the screams of wounded men from both sides would fill this darkness. Illumination flares were fired at the sky, and this would cast an eerie, flickering light over scenes of hand-to-hand combat that looked more like something out of a medieval battlefield that you might see in Hollywood than a 20th century war. And it was not quick either. The fighting would rage for hours, surging back and forth across the biovac area in confused, bloody knots of struggling men. Small groups of Americans would form impromptu defensive clusters, fighting back to back and pouring fire into the darkness at literally anything that moved or they thought that they heard. The Japanese attackers, knowing that they had no actual prospect of survival and no means of retreat, well, they would fight with ferocious abandon. They did not care about their lives. They had already accepted death by this point. Some had even gone and strapped explosives to their bodies, and once it is that they were wounded and dying, attempted to get close enough to American forces to detonate themselves in groups. This would add a further dimension of horror to the already nightmarish scene. As dawn broke on March 9th, the full scope of the carnage became visible. The bodies of Japanese attackers lay scattered across the biovac area, with many of them being cut down just yards from the foxholes that they had been trying to overrun. The cost to the Americans was severe, as approximately 100 Marines and airmen had been killed or wounded in the attack, with the Army Air Force contingent suffering especially heavy losses because many of them were simply support personnel who had limited infantry combat training and had never really expected to find themselves in close quarters fights for their lives. Among the American dead was First Lieutenant Harry Martin of the 5th Pioneer Battalion, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to organize the defense and rescue wounded men before he was killed. This attack was a grim reminder that on Iwo Jima, nowhere was truly safe, and that the Japanese tunnel network had transformed the entire island into a battlefield with no front lines, no rear areas. It was all just a battlefield. It was horrific. But really, even when talking about this, eventually, all nightmares must come to an end. As March would progress, the relentless American pressure began to tell on the Japanese defenders in ways that even Kuribayashi's meticulous preparations couldn't really fully compensate for. The fundamental problem facing the Japanese was that this was, by their own logic and by their own plan, a battle of attrition. They were losing men. They were losing ammunition, they were losing water, supplies, and more at a rate that they couldn't replenish them. Every position that was destroyed, every tunnel that was collapsed, every cave that was sealed, all of this reduced the defensive network by an increment that could never really be restored. The Marines might be suffering terrible casualties, yes, but they received a steady flow of replacements. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, equipment from the enormous logistical machine that was the United States that supported the operation offshore. The Japanese didn't have this. There was no lifeline. Every bullet that they fired was one that could not be replaced. Every man that was killed was one that could not be substituted. Every barrel of water that was consumed would bring the garrison one step closer to dying of thirst. Yes, Kuribayashi, knowing that this moment was going to come, had stockpiled enormous quantities of supplies before the battle began. But with the beginning coming from prolonged aerial and naval combat, and then afterwards the ground campaign, all of this had steadily depleted these reserves. By early March, water was becoming critically scarce for Japanese defenders, many of whom were reduced to quite literally licking moisture from the walls of their tunnels or collecting condensation in their helmets. Ammunition was being rationed, and some units were reduced to hoarding their remaining rounds for point-blank engagements rather than firing at distant targets. Medical supplies had been virtually all exhausted, and wounded Japanese soldiers simply had to lay in the tunnels without treatment, their injuries festering in the hot, fetid underground air while their comrades would continue to fight above and around them. Despite these deteriorating conditions, the Japanese resistance remained ferocious, and it showed no signs of the wholesale collapse that the Americans desperately hoped for. Kuribayashi's leadership would continue to hold the defense together through sheer force of will, personal example, and the unshakable determination that his soldiers were going to fulfill their duty and fight to the death. The general moved his command post several times, as the American advance would force him steadily northward, eventually establishing his final headquarters at a cave complex near Kitano Point at the extreme northern tip of the island. From this position, he continued to direct defense through runners and telephone lines, radio communications having been increasingly unreliable as equipment was destroyed and operators killed. He would exhort his men to fight on and extract every possible day of delay from the shrinking perimeter. His messages to Tokyo during these final weeks were stark and unsentimental, nothing emotional. They would provide accurate assessments of his deteriorating situation while affirming his determination to resist to the end. He knew that no one was going to come for him, nor did he expect it. In one of his final communications, he reported that his force had been reduced to a fraction of the original strength, that ammunition and water were nearly exhausted, and that the end was approaching. But he and his remaining men would continue to fight as long as they drew breath. In the end, things were a little bit strange for American forces, as the advance during the second and third weeks of March, right up to the very end, would be characterized by this paradoxical combination of accelerating territorial gains, but continued savage resistance. As the Japanese perimeter shrank, the Marines would advance more rapidly in terms of ground covered, yes, but the density of Japanese defenders per square yard of remaining territory would actually increase as things became tighter and tighter, meaning that the fighting grew more intense even as the end was approaching. The Japanese were being compressed into an ever smaller area at the northern end of the island, and the concentration of desperate, well-armed defenders in this shrinking pocket made every single yard of advance costly. The terrain in the far north was among one of the worst on the island, a chaotic jumble of gorges, ridges, and broken rock formations that the Japanese had fortified with the same thoroughness that had applied to, well, from what we've covered in this episode, everything else from the rest of the defensive network across the island. The Marines, by this point, were exhausted and mentally broken. Well, not broken, but for some of them, they were. They were operating on willpower and institutional discipline rather than anything that was resembling fresh physical or emotional reserves. Most of the men who had landed on the first D-Day, the actual landing operation on February 19th, and survived, and there were a few of them that were still there to that day, they had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks or more at an almost unprecedented duration for the intensity of fighting that they had experienced. Replacements who had arrived to fill in the gaps in the decimated rifle companies often became casualties themselves within literally hours or days, sometimes before their veteran comrades even learned what their names were who had replaced their previous friends. Officers were in especially short supply, as the Japanese had made a deliberate practice of targeting anyone who appeared to be a commander, and many platoons and even companies who were being led by sergeants and corporals had assumed responsibility after every commissioned officer had been killed or wounded. By the third week of March, the Japanese defensive perimeter had been compressed into 2 small pockets, one at the area around Katano Point in the far northwest, when Kuribayashi had his final command post, and another in a rugged gorge system in the northeast that the Marines had been unable to fully penetrate. The fighting to reduce these final pockets was some of the most brutal, vicious, and just horrifying of the entire battle, as the remaining Japanese defenders, with many of them, or rather I should say the majority of them, being wounded, starving, or delirious from thirst and exhaustion, would fight with desperate fury that was born from an absolute certainty of death. They did not care. There was no question of surrender for the vast majority of these men. And that is something that I need to kind of address. The refusal to surrender was something that was so deeply ingrained in the Japanese military psyche that it transcended orders and became a matter of personal identity and honor. For the men who were trapped in the shrinking pockets, the northern end of Iwo Jima, death was not just expected, it was something that was embraced as the final step in the fulfillment of their duty to the emperor, their families, their ancestors, their nation. Wounded men who could no longer fight would pull pins on their own grenades and held them against their bodies rather than risk being captured alive. Others would strap explosives to themselves and then crawl towards American positions, hoping to at least take one enemy with them in their death. In the tunnels and caves beneath the northern ridges, the scenes were beyond description. Hundreds of wounded, dying, and dead Japanese soldiers would lay in stifling darkness, air thick with the stench of gangrene and rot, human waste, and the sulfurous volcanic fumes. While those that were still capable of fighting would crouch at the entrances and firing ports, waiting for the next American assault with whatever ammunition they still had remaining. In fact, by this point, from what I'd already described, many had been reduced to fighting with sharpened sticks or rocks or bare hands, having exhausted their supply of bullets and grenades entirely. It is truly something that is baffling, but really all of this in the end mattered little. The end was coming, and most were going to embrace it. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 26, 1945, the 36th day of the battle, Kuribayashi would organize what would be the final Japanese offensive action on Iwo Jima. The exact nature and command of this action is something that is debated by historians for decades, with some accounts going and describing it as a formal banzai charge led personally by Kuribayashi, and others characterized it as a more organized infiltration attack designed to inflict maximum damage on rear area installations rather than just a suicidal frontal assault. What is known with absolute certainty is that in the early morning hours, a force of approximately 300 to 350 Japanese soldiers, representing virtually all of the remaining combat effective troops that Kuribayashi had, would emerge from the caves and tunnel complexes near Katano Point and would launch a coordinated attack southward towards the American rear areas near the western beaches in Airfield No. 2. Now, unlike the stereotypical banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles in the Pacific, this attack was something that appears to have been done carefully It was planned. It was directed at specific targets, particularly a biovac area occupied by Army Air Force pilots and ground crew of the 7th Fighter Command, a Marine shore party encampment, and also an adjacent field hospital and communication center. The attackers would move silently through the darkness, bypassing some American positions entirely and striking deep into areas that were considered well behind the front lines. And from that, the attack would achieve complete tactical surprise. The Japanese fell upon the sleeping airmen and support troops with swords, bayonets, knives, and grenades, and the resulting fight was a savage, confused melee that would rage for more than 3 hours in the darkness. Pilots who had been flying combat missions literally over the island just hours before would find themselves fighting for their lives with pistols and improvised weapons against Japanese soldiers that had, at this point, nothing left to lose. The airmen of the 7th Fighter Command, though not trained as infantry, would fight with desperate courage, organizing ad hoc defensive positions among their tents and aircraft in order to pour fire into the attackers at point-blank range. Marines from adjacent units would rush to the sound of fighting and join the battle, and as dawn broke, the full horror of the night's fighting would finally become visible. The bodies of Japanese attackers lay in heaps around the American positions, with many of them being killed at such close ranges that the uniforms were actually scorched by muzzle flash. Among the American dead were dozens of Army Air Forces personnel, including several pilots, as well as Marines and Navy personnel. One of the most tragic losses was that of Lieutenant Harry Martin, a Marine officer who had rallied the defenders and led counterattacks throughout the night before he himself was killed. The total American casualties from the attack numbered approximately 53 killed and over 100 wounded, while it is that virtually the entire Japanese attacking force was utterly annihilated. Now, the question of whether or not Kuribayashi personally participated in this final attack remains one of the mysteries of the battle. Some accounts, based primarily on Japanese sources and post-war testimonies from a handful of Japanese survivors, do claim that the general led the attack in person, armed with his sword, and that he was killed during the fighting or that he committed ritual suicide shortly afterward. Other accounts suggest that he remained in his cave headquarters and took his own life separately, either by shooting himself or by the traditional method of seppuku, possibly on March 23rd, 3 days before the final attack, after sending his last message to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. In this final communication, Kuribayashi had apologized for failing to hold the island, expressed his devotion to the emperor, and composed a series of death poems in the traditional Japanese style, one of which roughly translates as, quote, "Unable to complete this heavy task for our country, arrows and bullets all spent, so sad we fall." End quote. His body was never positively identified by the Americans, and the exact circumstances and date of his death remain uncertain to this very day. What is beyond dispute, though, is that he had accomplished his mission with extraordinary effectiveness. He had held the island for a whopping 36 days against overwhelming American superiority in numbers, firepower, logistics, aircraft, anything you can think of. He was outmanned, outgunned, outnumbered, out everything. And he had inflicted casualties on the Marines that exceeded even the most pessimistic American pre-battle estimates. On March 26, 1945, the same day as the final Japanese attack, Iwo Jima was officially declared secured by American forces. That declaration was something more of a formality rather than a reflection of actual reality. Significant mopping up operations would have to continue for weeks afterward, and scattered Japanese holdouts would still pose a lethal nuisance for months. But organized resistance had effectively ceased with the destruction of the last major Japanese force in the pre-dawn attack, and the island was then firmly in American hands. The cost of this victory, though, was staggering by any measure. American casualties totaled approximately 26,000 men, including roughly 6,800 killed in action and nearly 19,200 wounded, a casualty rate of approximately 1 in 3 for every Marine who set foot on the island. This made Iwo Jima the bloodiest single battle in the entire history of the United States Marine Corps, a distinction that it holds to this very day. These casualty figures were all the more shocking when considered in the context of the island's tiny size. Because if you recall what I said, I think back at the very beginning of this, Iwo Jima measured only around 8 square miles, meaning that on average, roughly 3,250 American casualties were being suffered for every square mile of territory gained. Some units were effectively destroyed as fighting formations. The 4th Marine Division, which had borne the brunt of the fighting in the meat grinder, would suffer such severe losses that it was withdrawn from combat after Iwo Jima and never made another amphibious assault. The 5th Marine Division, the newest of the 3 divisions and fighting its first major engagement, would lose so many men that some of its rifle battalions had to be reconstituted virtually from scratch. The 3rd Marine Division, though somewhat less devastated than the other two, nevertheless would suffer casualties that would take months to replace, and that would leave deep scars on its institutional memory. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions during the Battle of Iwo Jima. 14 of them were granted posthumously, representing more than a quarter of the 80 Medal of Honors that were awarded to the Marines during the entire Second World War. This extraordinary concentration of the nation's highest military decoration in just a single battle would reflect both the exceptional valor that was displayed by individual Marines and it would showcase how incredibly intense, awful, and desperate the fighting was that made these acts of heroism necessary in the first place. The Japanese losses, though, were even more catastrophic if you're looking at things in terms of proportion. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders who had garrisoned the island under Kuribayashi's command, 20,000 were killed, a death rate of over 95%. Only 216 Japanese soldiers were captured during the battle, and many of these were only taken because they were either too severely wounded to resist or they had been knocked unconscious by explosions. Really, when we were describing this, the cultural prohibition against surrender was so absolute that even in the final days, when resistance was clearly hopeless and death was absolutely certain, the overwhelming majority of Japanese defenders chose to instead fight to the death or kill themselves outright, rather than accept the disgrace of being captured. In fact, many of the 216 prisoners that we just listed here were not even Japanese. They were actually Korean laborers who had been conscripted into service and did not share the Japanese military's fanatical commitment to death before dishonor. An unknown number of additional Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the tunnel network for weeks and even months after the island was declared secured, emerging periodically to scavenge for food or water or to launch isolated attacks on American personnel. In fact, the last 2 known Japanese holdouts on Iwo Jima, Private First Class Yamakage Kufuku and Lance Corporal Matsudo Insoki, they did not surrender until quite literally years later, January 6, 1949, 4 years after the battle ended, having survived in the tunnels by collecting rainwater and stealing food from American supply dumps under the cover of darkness. When they finally emerged, gaunt and disoriented, they couldn't really believe that the war had been over for more than 3 years. And that story is actually shared by a lot of Japanese soldiers over the course of the war. Even before the battle was officially over, the United States began putting Iwo Jima to the use that had justified the enormous cost of its capture. On March 4th, while the fighting was still raging in the northern part of the island, a crippled B-29 superfortress named Dynamite from the 9th Bombardment Group would return from a bombing raid over Tokyo with damaged fuel lines and fading engines. It would make the first emergency landing on Airfield No. 1, which CB construction battalions had repaired and extended while under intermittent mortar and sniper fire from Japanese positions just a few hundred yards away. The pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Malo, would later say that the sight of the runway appearing through the haze ahead of him was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, as the alternative was ditching his aircraft and crew in the frigid waters of the Pacific with little prospect of rescue. The safe landing of Dynamite was the first tangible validation of the strategic rationale for the invasion, and this was seized upon by military leaders that were eager to demonstrate that the horrible blood price that Iwo Jima was paying was justified. In the months that followed, the island's value as an emergency landing field, though, is something that to this day is fairly contentious. The Japanese radar station that the American operators had captured, they would soon learn, had actually been incapable of providing necessary early warning data to the Japanese home island air defenses, which is a problem. For their part, prior to Operation Detachment, the Japanese had effectively written off the island's airfield for any significant operational employment. As a way station for U.S. Army Air Force's aircraft, Iwo Jima again appeared to offer very little advantage. Yes, utilizing Iwo Jima's airfields for U.S. escort fighters in the end could do something, but it proved to be logistically difficult and very hard on the P-51 pilots, who faced a 1,500 nautical mile round trip. The field's capacity, moreover, was actually rather limited, about the same that was provided by one Navy fleet carrier, so you could theoretically just put more carriers out there. The primary post-war justification was Iwo Jima's capacity to provide emergency landings for bombers, but While it is, yes, 2,251 B-29s did land on the island throughout the rest of the war, the majority of them were not strictly emergencies. The airfields did host an active search and rescue operation, but the number of downed US aviators that were picked up by aircraft from Iwo Jima is only around 50 something, which seems to be insignificant in comparison to the number of lives that were lost in the island's capture. Regardless, this absolute brutal battle was followed by the invasion of Okinawa, which would have similarly bloody results. These two invasions would demonstrate the determination and ferocity of the new Japanese strategy and caused American strategists to rethink their plans to invade the Japanese home islands. Codenamed Operation Downfall, from which up to 1.5 million Purple Heart medals were being prepared in anticipation of truly horrendous casualties, it ultimately did not happen. In the end, the casualties that were suffered from these battles and the predictions that were made of what it would take to actually commit to Operation Downfall would all play a significant part in President Truman's decision to use the atomic bombs in an attempt to end the war, which it would. Either way, the courage and sacrifice of the men at Iwo Jima to end the Pacific War is something that, to this very day, is remembered. Again, yes, this may have been a sponsored episode, but it is one that I am incredibly happy that I was able to make here, that we were able to go into as much detail as we possibly had. And I want to thank all of you for watching or listening, depending upon what it is that you are doing here right now. Thank you, my friends, for listening. I really do appreciate you. I want you to let me know in the comment section below what it is that you would like to do next. I'm going to leave a link to this watch both down in the description and also in the comment section. On YouTube, when I put this up there. On Spotify, I can't really do a linked comment on there, but it will be in the description, so you'll be able to click that there. Thank you all very much. I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.